Welcome to episode 480. This week, Mike Stone lost the election last summer to become the next president of the SBC, and now he's suing Russell Moore over it. Then, we unpack Peter Wehner's article in The Atlantic about the breaking apart of evangelicalism. Is the church a victim of media manipulation, or is evangelicalism just reaping its own rotten fruit? Then I talk with Professor Randall Balmer about his new book, Bad Faith: Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Most people think conservative evangelicals organized into a political movement in the 70s in response to the Roe v. Wade decision. But knowing the truth, says Balmer, helps explain the current state of the American evangelical movement. All of that, plus Christians are training for hand-to-hand combat in cars, and Phil has a massive magical mushroom.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Phil Vischer. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
Books are looking good. We're talking about your bookcase. You got a lot of books. Skye, Skye, no, I'm not going to mention that. Nah,
just don't look too closely.
Don't look too closely. Well, really? Do you have bad?
They're fake, aren't they?
Do you have?
Yeah, I have fake notes.
You have naughty books on your shelf?
Ooh.
No, just don't attribute them to my theology.
Like romance novels and inappropriate things?
No.
Oh.
So some of your books are there for competitive research. It's like, what are the other guys saying?
Yeah, as everyone's
theology?
Library should be.
Yes, yeah, okay, I hear you. And Skye Jitani's here. Hi, Skye.
I'm here, but my bookshelf is facing a direction where the webcam cannot see it.
Yeah, and
sure.
I can't quite see your Banksy either. You're blocking your Banksy.
There he is.
Yeah, that's too bad. Okay, slide him. Can you slide him down the wall? Could you
no,
put
it's
him
a
on
decal.
Could you? I know, but if you could put it like a little train track along your wall there, and then you could have a little train, and then you could have a Banksy standing in the train, and like Trolley on Mr. Rogers, you could make it slide back and forth down the wall. That
I'm sure
cool.
that would be riveting for all the audio podcast listeners out there.
It would make a noise. They would at least know what was happening, like little ching ching of Trolley. That would no. Hey, Trolley's here. All right, time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. I got to tell you about my mushroom. Can I tell you about my mushroom?
I was not expecting that. So.
Is that a big no? Is that a big no from everyone? I can't tell you about my mushroom. I saw like 4 or 5 mushrooms along the side of my road when I drove into my house. So I got my granddaughter, she's 4.5, and we went on an expedition to go walk out along the side of the road and find them. And we picked 4 of them and we brought them back into the house. The biggest one is almost as big as my head. They are solid, round balls, like this big.
Puffballs.
You know.
Oh, yeah. TikTok is all over puffballs.
Okay. Really? TikTok is all over? They're called giant puffball mushrooms. And they look, they feel like Nerf. They're the consistency of Nerf. They're heavy, but it's almost as big as my head. It's the biggest mushroom I've ever seen. So
Are they safe?
Well, that's what we wanted to know. Like, could we eat this? Will it kill us? Will it make us have crazy dreams? And would it make me more creative as a writer? I don't know.
Really tick off the Smurf living inside of it.
So, and it's just a ball. It's not. There's no stem. It's not on a stand. It's just a ball. It's just a ball. Just a Nerf ball. You could play catch with it. I don't know how hard you could throw it and catch it before it breaks up and, little critters come out. And we were debating because I posted a picture of me holding it up next to my head to my family on my extended family feed so they could all comment. And people were wondering, they were suggesting what we should try to do with it. Should we try to cook it? My cousin or my niece said, microwave it and see what happens. Put it in the microwave. I suggested putting it in our Instant Pot for a few days.
Oh, days?
To see what happens. So we don't know what's going to happen to it. It's edible. We Googled it. You can eat it if it's if it's young and it hasn't spored. And I'm looking at it and I have no idea how to tell if it's spored or not. So we decided not to eat it. Because what is it? How do you know if it's spored, you TikTokers?
It's like the color, if you cut into it, if it's totally white, I think that's what it is. And then it's right. And you need to get on TikTok because people are like turning it into pizza crusts and eating it. Like they're doing all these wild things with it.
What?
I'm looking at pictures right now. There's endless creative options here, Phil. These could be like an alternative to carving pumpkins at Halloween, I suppose.
I have also seen something like that. Yeah.
What? We got 3 of them and they're huge and we could carve them into things. I just wasn't sure if I would, release the Kraken if I cut into it, or I'm just afraid I'm going to wake up and whatever is inside it will be on my face.
That's concerning.
Yeah, it doesn't look natural. It doesn't. It looks like some kind of chemical byproduct that came from a plant nearby. Like
I know.
Industrial, not
I know.
organic.
They're insane. So look it up if you're not on TikTok. I guess all the groovy kids on TikTok are all into mushrooms these days. But it's called a giant puffball mushroom. And my granddaughter and I picked a whopper. And we're trying to figure out what to do with it and how long it can sit on our kitchen table before something bad happens to our whole house. That's what we're wondering. That's my mushroom story.
Well, if it does spore, maybe you don't want it just sitting there for a long period of time.
What does it mean? I don't even know what that means, that it spores. It shoots out little children? What spiders come out? And
I think it's just poisonous then.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, you just have a time bomb in your kitchen.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking because my niece wants me to bring it up to Michigan for the 4th of July so she can see it. And I said, I'm pretty sure it's going to explode by March. Something's going to happen.
When Amanda and I were first married, we lived in a pretty small little apartment when I was in seminary.
Yeah.
And I woke up in the middle of the night.
Is this a mushroom story?
It is a mushroom story.
Oh, okay.
And I woke up in the middle of the night to Amanda screaming in the bathroom. And I didn't know what was going on, but I went in and she's screaming because there were mushrooms growing in our bathroom. And
that weren't there the day before, or
no, they were not there the night before. Like she went to bed, we went to bed. There were no mushrooms in our bathroom, and in the middle of the night, she got up to use the bathroom and noticed that there were mushrooms growing in our bathroom.
What?
I know, it's crazy. And she started freaking out, and
where? Like in your towels? Do you guys not wash your towels?
No,
you're supposed to wash them.
It was like in the grout line between the tile and the tub.
Your grout
on the floor
was dirty enough to grow mushrooms?
We had just moved into the place. We were newlyweds. We just moved in there.
I'm sorry, Skye. There is no way this story does not reflect poorly on you.
Well, that's what Amanda thought. She was horrified. And she was like, you cannot tell anybody that we had mushrooms growing in our bathroom.
Yeah. What else was growing in your bathroom?
I don't know. Who knows on the microscopic level? Okay. But it was not the cleanest place. We did a lot to that apartment to try to make it livable. But, we were newlyweds. I was a seminary student, but we did not cut those mushrooms nor try to eat them.
Good.
Yeah.
Did you pick them with your granddaughter?
If I had a granddaughter when I was that age, and something went really weird.
Probably too many mushrooms. Okay. We need to talk today. This is new. This is something new. We're going to talk about the evangelical church. Okay. Unusual. I know. We're taking sort of a right-hand turn here. We're going to talk about the evangelical church. And the news is not all good. This is usually a feel-good podcast. We talk about feel-good stories, about all the great things that are happening in the world and in religion. The news is not all good. So here's the first one. A group in Southwest Missouri says it's having an event to train Christians in hand-to-hand combat. A group says its mission is to halt and push back the forces of darkness. It's holding a tactical event in Southwest Missouri this weekend to train Christians in, quote, hand-to-hand combat and quote, fighting from your vehicle.
What happened to our battle is not against flesh and blood?
Yeah, but sometimes it is. But just in case.
From your vehicle?
Fighting from your vehicle. Caitlin, how many times have you thought to yourself, dang it, I wish I could fight from my vehicle. It would be a lot more convenient right now.
Not once, no.
Really? Never?
No.
Are they
You have led a privileged life to
I mean,
never
that's
once
true.
have had to fight from your vehicle. Skye, how many times have you had to fight from your vehicle?
I don't want to answer that question. The
So
Wait, are they
the
advocating
answer is non-zero. Is that what you're saying? The answer?
are they advocating drive-by shootings?
No, that's not fighting from your vehicle. I assume this is sort of a Mad Max thing. You know, everything's going to heck, and we're going to have to defend ourselves. The leader of the group says, we're a group of Christian men and women that go out and will stand against unrighteousness. This will be an intensive study about self-defense. What happens if you were driving, now we get down to brass tacks. What happens if you were driving on I-70 last year when all those riots were taking place in Kansas City and St. Louis? It's about time that Christians start going on the offense. At least stop being always on the defense.
Wait a minute. Were there any motorists that were attacked and pulled from their cars on I-70 from those protesters?
What happens if there were? Skye, would you have been ready?
What happens if monkeys fly out of my butt? I won't be ready for that. That's something that
I know, but I will cover it on the podcast, and I'll have a theme song for it.
I mean, this is ridiculous. There's endless hypotheticals.
So, the leader has organized protests in several Missouri cities against forced tyrannical vaccinations. Says one of the very first sentences in our Constitution is the right to pursue liberty, but our liberties are getting taken away now at a pace that's unfathomable.
That's not in the Constitution. It's the Declaration of Independence.
On a pace that he might say was inconceivable. I am not crazy. If you have to say I am not crazy when you're being interviewed by the press,
not good.
You might be crazy. I'm a God-fearing, USA-loving person. I never, ever in my life expected to be doing the things I'm doing now. Well, that might be another sign that you might actually be crazy.
It actually sounds like he doesn't love the USA. He only loves certain parts of it.
The Salt and Light Brigade is part of Pass the Salt Ministries.
Should be Pass the Ammunition Ministries.
I just don't know. I don't even know what to say about that. Brigade members / Christians who understand the times in which we live in. Are you a brigade member and or a Christian? Because we need to learn tactical skills, preparedness skills, and fighting skills.
The crazy part is they also have a puppet team.
Yeah, but that's the only puppet team that's armed with live ammo. The good news in this story is update. The organizer of the Missouri Embattled Warriors event said it has been canceled. It doesn't say
no
why.
explanation.
May have been weather.
Turnout.
May have been. I don't know. It was canceled.
We can only hope.
Okay, so that's one story of how the white evangelicals are faring in these troubled times. Second story, how the white evangelicals are faring in these troubled times. You probably heard this over the last week. You know our friend Russell Moore. He's been on the show 3 or 4 times. Good friend of ours. Left the SBC over stuff. And he's now being sued. Mike Stone files lawsuit against SBC rival Russell Moore. Remember who Mike Stone is?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, he was running to be president of the SBC, and he lost. He lost by a nose. He was the leader of the new conservative resurgence. There was an old conservative resurgence in the SBC, but then the old conservative resurgence, even it started to look not as conservative as it could be. So they had to have a new conservative resurgence against the old conservative resurgence, and Mike Stone was the leader of that, and he wanted to be the president so they could kick out all the people that think there's a need for critical race theory or stuff.
Wait a minute.
I don't want to defame him in any way because apparently he'll sue me.
So you're saying an ultra-conservative Southern Baptist white guy who's a big supporter of Donald Trump lost an election and decided to sue and protest? I can't believe it.
Yes. So Mike Stone claims that Russell Moore cost him the SBC presidency. So he's suing him for $750,000. Because I assume that's how much he figured he would make if he was the president of the SBC. Lawyers for Georgia pastor Mike Stone filed a complaint Monday in the U.S. District Court in the Middle District of Tennessee accusing former Southern Baptist ethicist, hey, there's an ethicist, let's sue them, I don't like their ethics, accusing him of defamation, false light invasion, Anyone have any idea what false light invasion is? That's a fun one.
False
What?
light invasion.
Yeah, you invaded me with your false light. Maybe it was to get rid of the coronavirus.
That sounds like the Bay of Pigs. It was a
Yeah, that would be a false flag invasion.
yeah,
That would
or
make that.
a light invasion that was done falsely.
Oh wait, false light invasion of privacy. That was on the next
Oh.
page. Privacy
Oh.
was on the next page.
Phil,
But I still don't know, how do you invade someone's privacy with false light? And intentional infliction of emotional distress. Stone, pastor of Emmanuel Baptist in Blackshear, Georgia, seeks at least $750,000 in damages. You owe me $750,000 because you distressed me, and now I'm not the president of the SBC.
I have a question.
What?
So I read that article, and they cite these letters that were written by Russell Moore.
That were
But-
leaked. The
But
leaked
they were
letters.
private letters that were leaked.
Yeah.
So
who
I'm
leaked them?
assuming.
Who
Well, that's
leaked
the
them?
question.
Mhm.
Isn't it the leak that ended up doing the damage, not the writing of the letter itself?
I think he probably assumes that Russell Moore was involved in the leaking.
Yeah.
Oh.
I assume.
But do they have evidence of that?
Stone's? I don't know. Let's get him on the phone. Anyone have Mike Stone's phone number? Can we get him on the phone right now to ask him for details about his legal case? I'm sure he would be more than willing. Stone says that the letters contained false allegations that damaged his reputation and diminished his future earnings. Because it's one thing for a Christian brother to criticize you. It's another thing for a Christian brother to damage your future earnings. And that you can't. I'm just wondering, what percentage of Southern Baptist leaders do you think, believe in the Pauline principle that you don't take a Christian brother to court?
All of them,
that's-
hypothetically.
That's because it's just like, if you wanted to be the president of the SBC, would it make you more likely to hold that biblical position unless you lose the election?
I think what's also troubling here is not just that he has filed this lawsuit, but again, I could be mistaken. I don't see it in the article, but I didn't hear anything about Mike Stone seeking direct engagement with Russell Moore in any kind of arbitration or resolution of a disagreement before choosing to go to court.
Well, no, he can't, because here's a quote: as a direct and proximate result of defendant's false and defamatory statements, plaintiff has suffered a tremendous loss in professional cultivation.
Okay.
I don't know what that is. And reputational standing, decreased earning power, the presidency of the SBC, and serious mental and emotional injury in the form of extreme public embarrassment, stress, anxiety, and fear. Russell Moore made him fearful. So that's like 150 grand. He embarrassed him. That's 50 grand. He stressed him. That's 75 grand. And he lost some professional cultivation. So that's 200 grand, would you say?
If I had to sue every person who ever embarrassed me for $50,000, I'd have to wipe out my own mother.
Wow. I was thinking you'd have to wipe out yourself.
Well, I don't know if that's possible in the court system.
I wasn't predicting you'd turn on your mother for this analogy.
She made a career out of it. Are you kidding me? She loved embarrassing me.
Okay. So Caitlin, you're from the South. No, you're not. You're from all over the place. Caitlin, you went to school in the South.
Yeah, I did.
What do you think about this? You're Southern adjacent, SBC adjacent.
I really don't want to be the one that's speaking for the SBC, but I will say I saw a lot of people on Twitter get out of this little conundrum, Phil, by doing a really simple, great, easy thing that Christians have done for a long time that we should always do, which is go, yes, this applies to Christians, but Russell Moore is not a Christian. And so
really, you saw people. Wow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the first thing with the people learning to fight. It's like, once you've decided someone isn't one of us, then none of the regular rules apply to them.
Right. We Christians need to be both ready to decide who isn't a Christian so we can take them to court, but also so we can engage them in hand-to-hand combat from our cars.
Right.
And I think that's how Mike Stone should settle this with Russell Moore. They have to hand fight while sitting in their cars
Each of them
next to each
in
other.
a car.
Yes. Yeah. You have to, it's like cops in a donut parking lot, when you pull up side by side in opposite directions so you can talk through the window. But they have to hand fight, like slap fight. But they have to go to the event in Southwest Missouri to learn how to do it. And unfortunately, the event was canceled due to lack
Real
of
loss
sanity.
for all of us. Yeah.
Okay, wait. I have another question.
Yeah.
Did Stone's attorneys say anything? What did they offer as refutation that what was in these letters isn't true? Because that's what it all hinges on, right? That what is in these letters is absolutely
because Mike Stone says that it wasn't true.
Well, duh.
Yeah.
But there's a lot coming out now about what, and more going to come out as the investigation goes deeper into the cover up of sexual abuse within the SBC. And since they've waived the privilege, there's going to be a lot more coming out. So I suppose over time, we're going to know whether or not what was said in those letters about Mike Stone was accurate or not. Is this him positioning ahead of that news coming out by getting ahead of it and saying it's false already, and I already have a lawsuit claiming it's false, and so he's protecting him, covering his butt, if you will?
Stone is a leading figure in the Conservative Baptist Network, which is my favorite TV network. The shows are great, but they don't do dance competitions. Rod Martin is a leading member of the Conservative Baptist Network. He has blamed Moore for stirring up controversy over sexual abuse in the denomination and causing trouble for the executive committee. In a recent podcast, another conservative SBC, Founders Ministries, Martin, with Founders Ministries, Martin was asked about controversies in the executive committee, and he said, what happened to the executive committee is Russell Moore. As you know, Russell Moore, who used to be the chief ethicist of the Southern Baptist Convention, was head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the last several years, suddenly resigned at the end of May, and on his way out, in typical disgruntled employee fashion, carpet bombed his employer.
All right.
That's what Russell
Moore
Moore
this. This is just so rich.
Oh, okay.
I mean, think about this. You have an option here. There are at least 3 different things you could get upset about.
Yeah.
You could choose to get upset with the fact that a horrible number of people have been sexually abused in SBC churches, which is horrific and evil. You could choose to be upset about that.
Yeah. Okay.
You could choose to be upset that for years there were efforts to cover up the degree of abuse and silence victims and not really deal with it. You could be super upset about that.
Yeah.
Or you can be upset with the one guy who was upset about those first 2 things. And that's what they've chosen here, is they're upset with Russell Moore, blaming him because he actually cared about the first 2 things I mentioned, which is just insane that they're all upset with Russell Moore for exposing abuse and hypocrisy in the SBC.
When the thing they should be upset about is that not enough Southern Baptists can engage in hand-to-hand combat from their automobiles. I want to do an event where we teach people to engage in hand-to-hand combat from their bicycles. That's hard.
We could do like jousting.
Have you ever tried to like
jousting?
Yeah. That's jousting. You get a broomstick.
That's just riding towards someone. Yeah, and you ride the broomstick, and now you're playing, what's the Harry Potter game?
Quidditch?
Quidditch. Let's combine Quidditch with hand-to-hand combat from your bicycle. I don't think joust with a broom.
I don't think white evangelicals can do anything that involves
while quoting
broomsticks.
Russell Moore. It could be. Caitlin, help me out, because I feel like
I don't know that I can help you out.
I feel like I've lost the thread.
Here's in the same vein as what Skye said. I like the fact that Russell Moore and other people have been saying for a long time that these people who are freaking out about CRT or who are ignoring the sexual abuse problem, that one of the main reasons this is all the problem is not just because they're acting immorally, but because it's causing a problem of witness for the church. And I like that the response to that was like, you think that we are hurting the witness of the church? We'll do it way more by then doing exactly how Scripture describes the witness of the church as hurt, which is not dealing with our problems with each other, but by using a legal system to sue other people. Which, again, I feel like the running theme of so many of these debates is are we actually looking at the fruit of the people involved in determining who might actually be telling the truth about things? It is telling to me that Russell Moore is not acting the way and having the character of the people who are opposing him. And we might want to like actually consider that maybe the people who are acting horribly in all sorts of other ways might be on the wrong side of this specific question about sexual abuse in the SBC.
But remember, okay, I give you that, Caitlin. Well done. Well said.
You.
But now I have to shoot at full holes. Remember, it was this last week or the week before, the story, the conservative story in the American Conservative, that evangelicalism has two futures. One future is the way of Russell Moore, and CT, et cetera. And the other future is the way of Doug Wilson, standing up for your beliefs. And he's also been accused of covering up cases of sexual abuse. And that's the way that church should go. The Doug Wilson, stand up for your beliefs and maybe cover up sexual abuse. So clearly there's a larger movement here that says Christianity is combative, pugilistic, engages in hand-to-hand combat from automobiles, and covers up accusations of sexual abuse. What's your problem with that?
I don't think I need to answer that. But it's very similar, though. Doug Wilson, like, if you're going to have the exemplar of your other option be covering up sexual abuse cases and justifying slavery, we can look at the fruit there and kind of tell that one of those options is better than the other. And if your main goal is someone who will fight for you, then that's a different standard that might make you pick the other one.
We need a fighter.
Unless you're a victim of sexual abuse, and then we won't fight for you.
Yes.
Is that... Oh boy, that really puts it on another footing. Mm-hmm. Is this the impact? Now we're segueing into our third story. Those were so much fun. A fourth story, if you count my mushroom. Was that an official story? Was my mushroom an official story? Okay,
I marked it down for the description. So yeah. It's
if you get it published somewhere, Phil.
If I get it published, I take that challenge, Skye Jitani. You will see my mushroom's going to become the most famous mushroom in evangelical blogdom. I don't know. How much of this was impacted by Trump and, just the pugilistic nature of the person that so many evangelicals embraced as, inspiring and a fighter. We like him because he's a fighter. We like him because he's, owning the libs. Versus how was Trump just the, kind of symptom of the direction we were already headed, of feeling embattled and wanting to engage in hand-to-hand combat from our cars so we don't actually have to get out in the mud. But thoughts?
I'm pretty sure it's the latter.
Okay. So this isn't all Donald Trump's fault. I can't blame it on one guy.
No, not at all. I think this has been in the works for decades. I think Trump may have accelerated the trend a little bit. But by no means did he just kind of land out of the sky from nowhere and bring us these terrible things.
Okay. Our friend Peter Wehner, who was on the show, episode 441, where he talked to Skye about the future of the Republican Party, wrote a long piece for The Atlantic with the headline, "The Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart." Subtitle, "Christians Must Reclaim Jesus from His Church." That's a theologically complicated statement to unpack. He starts with the story of David Platt, the 43-year-old pastor at McLean Bible Church in Virginia. He's theologically conservative, had been accused in the months before this elder vote by a small but zealous group within his church of quote-unquote wokeness and being quote-unquote left of center, of pushing for social justice, of promoting critical race theory, and of attempting to purge conservative members from his elders board. So there was a lawsuit. It was one of the first times I've ever seen a lawsuit in court over a vote for elders in a church.
That fits our theme so far today of Christians suing other Christians in public court.
Related to that, the Christian Post published an op-ed by one of its contributors criticizing religious conservatives like Platt, Russell Moore, Beth Moore, Ed Stetzer as progressive Christian figures who commonly champion leftist ideology. Michael,
hold on. Just like the list of people they mentioned there, They are
Yeah.
so theologically conservative.
Yeah, but that's not enough, Skye.
But
That's
the
not
two
enough.
things they hold in common is they believe racism is real, and they're not supporters of Donald Trump.
And most of them, if not all of them, spoke up about sexual abuse in the
Right.
church.
But
See,
that suddenly is what
they're
makes you
troublemakers, Skye.
a woke liberal?
They're trying to make us look bad. Yeah, and they believe they promote leftist ideology. Michael Emerson, sociology professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, has spent the past 3 years studying race and Christianity. Emerson says the divisions and conflicts we found are intense, easily more intense than I've seen in my 25 years of studying the topic. He said what seems to be approaching is an emerging day of reckoning within churches. The root of the discord lies in the fact that many Christians have embraced the worst aspects of our culture and our politics. This is Peter Wehner talking. When the Christian faith is politicized, churches become repositories not of grace, but of grievances, places where tribal identities are reinforced, where fears are nurtured, and where aggression and nastiness are sacralized. Ooh. Caitlin, I know you've got a point of view on you didn't we had a little to say about the mushroom, but I think you have something to say about this.
Well, it's funny that you put that exact line, because that was the line that I like kind of both agree with and struggle with a little bit, which is that
Okay.
I don't love when we say our faith has been politicized, or that a problem in the church has come about because we've gotten politics involved in it, and that's like a cause to the problem. The problem is not that we've added politics to our churches. The problem is that we've added a politics that is foreign to our faith and not the politics that is native to it. We can't just kind of take all the political stuff out of it. I think sometimes we look at the problem kind of like you were just saying. We think that it's just Donald Trump, like came in and messed up stuff in our churches without recognizing, I think later in the article it says, the problems aren't doctrinal problems, the problems are political problems. Those aren't necessarily two different things. They're definitely not mutually exclusive. And I think too many of us are looking at problems in our churches or problems in the evangelical church in general and are going, if we could just stop fighting about politics, if we could stop letting that divide us, then things would be fine. When in reality, like Skye said, the problems are way more deeply rooted than just recent political developments. But also the fact that people in your church are fighting over Donald Trump, fighting over immigration, fighting over Black Lives Matter, is in part because, yes, as the article describes, they've been disciplined by political forces in the media to have really different opinions than each other, and they're clashing. But there are theological differences at play in why people are like succumbing to those political forces. And if you just think, hey, if we stop talking about politics in our church, or we get the church less politicized, that would fix the problem, then your people still have really deep theological disagreements about how we engage culture, how we think about race and ethnicity, how we think about what flourishing looks like in our communities. And those aren't going to those will bubble up the next time something political happens. They're not going to get fixed by just talking about politics less, which isn't the heart of the article, but I think we use that word politics too loosely. And then we end up making it sound like that's the problem, when the problem is that politics and theology, there is not a sharp line between them. There never has been historically. And the problems in our churches are always both. And we're not going to solve them by just kind of stopping talking about the problem.
I agree totally. And I think a better word would have been, instead of politics, if he had said the problem in a lot of our churches is partisanship.
Yeah.
And I've said this before, but I think part of the reason we are where we are is because for decades, pastors and church leaders haven't talked enough about politics.
Yeah.
We've not talked about the social dimensions of our faith and the corporate, even political dimensions of being a Christian in a pluralistic society. We've just not talked about it. We've avoided those topics so much in the church that we've surrendered that territory of discipleship over to the media and to partisan actors. And that's what fruit we're now seeing. So could you imagine, like, for example, if the church never, ever, ever talked about marriage or sexuality? Well, who's going to shape people's views on it in the church? It's going to come from the culture. So most of us have avoided talking about this stuff. And now we're realizing, the media is what's formed our people, and it's very partisan media. And now that's what's popping up in our churches.
Right. Okay. Pete Wehner talked to all sorts of people. He talked to Tim Keller about it. He talked to Kristen Kobes-Dumais about it. He talked to a bunch of people that have been on the Holy Post podcast about it. Keller argued that anti-institutional tendency in evangelicalism, American evangelicalism, makes evangelical communities more prone than others to what he calls insider abuse, corruption committed by leaders who have no guardrails and no oversight, and outsiderism, in which evangelicals simply refuse to let their church form them or their beliefs. So even their own churches are considered institutions that I'm not going to let shape me. As a result, many evangelicals are unrooted and therefore susceptible to political idolization, fanatical ideas, and conspiracy theories. James Ernest, the vice president of Erdman's Publishers, says what we're seeing is massive discipleship failure caused by massive catechesis failure. We have a failure of catechesis. That's exciting. The evangelical church in the U.S. over the last 5 decades has failed to form its adherents into disciples, so there is a great hollowness. All that was needed to cause the implosion that we have seen was a sufficiently provocative stimulus. And that stimulus came. I think Trump, they're saying, was the stimulus.
And COVID.
Trump and COVID and George Floyd.
Right.
Is there anything else? Yeah, I think that was primarily it. Like, are you going to wear a mask or not? Do Black Lives Matter or not? Was the election stolen or not? And those 3 things have, there's a stat in here that 29% of pastors said in the last year they've considered quitting. 29, that's almost a third of 1 out of 3 pastors said, I don't think I can do this anymore.
I've had phone calls with a couple of folks like that in recent weeks and from around the country. And it's very true. And exactly what Pete Wehner is describing in this story is what they've told me, that their churches are just being torn apart by all this stuff. One pastor I talked to, I asked him, why did you get into ministry in the first place? He's about my age. And he said, I honestly believed that the local church is the hope of the world, which is a line that Bill Hybels always used to use. And he said to me, I asked him, well, what's changed? And he said, when I'm in my community and I'm at the grocery store and I run into people who aren't Christians or who don't go to any church, the thought honestly occurs to me that their life will be worse if they come to my church. And he said, I don't know how to lead an institution that's making people's lives worse when I got into this to help people be better. And that's a damning indictment of where we are. And it's sad, but these stories are very real. And I know there are pastors listening to this who identify with that.
Yeah. Alan Jacobs is a professor at Baylor University. He says culture catechizes. Many churches aren't that interested in catechesis at all. They focus instead on entertainment because entertainment is what keeps people in their seats and coins in the offering plate. And that this isn't a problem limited to the faithful on one side of the aisle or the other. This is true of both the Christian left and the Christian right. People come to believe what they are most thoroughly and intensively catechized to believe. And that catechesis comes not from the churches, but from the media they consume, or rather the media that consume them. The churches have barely better than a snowball's chance in hell of shaping most people's lives. Ouch. What is it? Has anyone done the math? Skye, are you okay? Everything?
I'm having problems. My mouse died. I need to charge it really quick, or otherwise I can't control anything. I can't even mute you right now.
Never mute me, Skye. It's
not in your contract. I can't mute myself.
Okay. Has anyone ever done the math to determine what exactly is a snowball's chance in hell? Or is that a meaningless statement?
It sounds meaningless.
It sounds kind of meaningless because is hell the fire thing or is it the outer darkness thing? Because the outer darkness thing might actually be cold.
How did we get to hell? When did hell come up?
I don't know, Skye.
I just took my headphones off for like 20 seconds and suddenly we're talking about a theology.
Never take your headphones off when I'm talking.
I had to.
You'll come back and you'll be lost.
You would be lost anyway.
Alan Jacobs says the churches have barely better than a snowball's chance in hell of shaping most people's lives. And I was just wondering if anyone's ever done the math on that.
What a snowball's chance in hell really is.
What is a snowball's chance in hell? Or is it a meaningless? Okay, never mind. With all those media, what all those media want is this is important. Listen to this, Skye. Skye, keep your headphones on. Are your headphones on?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't
I've been
touch
following
anything.
along in the article, but I can't scroll now because my mouse is dead.
Oh, that was the problem. That's why you had to stop listening to me. What all those media want is engagement, and engagement is most reliably driven by anger and hatred. Jacobs argued, they make bank when we hate each other. And so that hatred migrates into the church, which doesn't have the resources to resist it. For many Christians, their politics have become more of an identity marker than their faith. And I know
Okay.
we've said this before. You've said this before. Skye says timeout. Okay.
Timeout,
Is that
timeout,
how you
timeout.
mute me? Are you
Yes.
muting me? Okay.
I'm doing the timeout. So I like what Alan Jacobs said here, except for one thing.
Okay.
Of course, the church has the resources to combat it.
No, we don't. We need more
Of
money.
course we do. We have the Spirit of God. We have the
Oh.
scriptures. We have the resources to combat this.
God doesn't understand Facebook algorithms.
I'm going to go
It's
back.
too new.
Was it Freiling who said earlier in the article, this is a failure of discipleship, or someone else said a failure of
Yes.
catechesis?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the truth here. We are reaping what we have sown. We have seen this develop for decades. We've been sowing fear and anger in the church. What he says about the media wanting engagement
Yes.
and using fear and anger to engage, the church has been doing that as well. The evangelical industrial complex has been doing the exact same thing through Christian radio, sadly through some Christian podcasts, through a lot of Christian media. We have been doing the exact same thing, and we are reaping what we've sown because we have wanted engagement. We've wanted to sell tickets to conferences. We've wanted to sell books. We've wanted to sell people on Christian radio. And this is what you get. We get people who are catechized into the culture wars rather than into the gospel. And now it's inflamed because of what's happened in the last year or two. And it's coming out in our churches. And the pastors are the ones who are left to deal with it. And I'm not saying that every church leader is off the hook either, because we have a responsibility in this as well. But this is not something that the culture did to the church and the church was powerless to do anything about. We've done it to ourselves.
That's not very encouraging, Skye.
No, it's
Caitlin?
not.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like there's plenty of forces actively doing that in the church. But then there's also the mentality of a lot of pastors in regular churches or Bible study teachers or whatever, that people are being formed politically and socially by those other forces outside the church. And then they won't bring any of that to church with them. Like, I'll be in Bible study and someone can just come to a passage and it's a blank slate and they're not bringing all of the formation that they've had culturally and politically with them. It's that same anti-institutional, anti-tradition kind of evangelical ethos that says, I can sit down with a Bible and I'll just understand it. And we've thought if people just listen to good sermons that just tell you what the Bible says, and we sit in Bible study and we just read what the Bible says, we'll get it. When I have been in Bible studies with people who grew up on conservative media and have been really shaped to believe that being a certain kind of Republican is what it means to be a Christian, who have read verses, literally we went through James, they're reading verses about wealth and poverty and have all of the right things to say about why that doesn't actually apply to them. And they don't think that they're reading it with a lens, and I don't typically sit down and read and think I'm reading with a lens. But what comes out is the way that they were formed politically. And I think a lot of pastors and churches, unfortunately, think that they can be formed politically outside and it'll shape how they vote or the protests they go to or whatever, and it won't shape how they're reading scripture or their spiritual life or the way they treat their neighbor personally. And it obviously is doing all of those things. So just being like, if we all were just reading our Bibles more, or we were just hearing more sermons that told us what the Bible said, it would fix the problem. Because that's almost sometimes those statements of like, you're only in church for an hour sounds like, well, if you were just in church for more hours, you would totally get it figured out. And it's like, that's kind of a naive way of thinking about how people are as humans and how they learn things. They're going to still be bringing all that stuff that they're learning out, quote unquote, outside the church with them. And then it's a mutually reinforcing thing that you have to, that's why I have a lot of sympathy for pastors dealing with congregations that have been really brought into this partisan mindset and they're fighting with each other. But we have to have a really like courageous moment of intervening in that and figuring out what it means to disciple people, counter those things, which doesn't happen by pretending like that stuff is just happening outside the church and it's not impacting what they're doing when they're reading the Bible with each other.
I wonder, imagine a moment where what's going on in the American church right now, the white evangelical church wasn't happening, but instead white evangelicals were being overrun by, I don't know, Scientology or some really obvious heretical theological framework, right? The church would be up in arms. Leaders would be freaking out about it. We'd have, movements of pastors who are combating this in their churches. But because it's conservative Christian nationalism and republicanism, I don't know if we're taking this as seriously as we should be. This is just as much a heretical gospel as Scientology would be if it were the thing that was coming into our church.
Well, we are doing that. We're doing it against critical race theory, which is a heretical gospel that's taking over the church, and we all have to learn how to fight it from our cars.
Okay, you can have that argument whether or not critical race theory is a heretical gospel, but the fact that we don't see any heretical gospels coming from the right side of the spectrum
No,
is a massive blind spot.
That's where Jesus lives, Skye.
But this is my point: is
he lives in the first house on the right.
This has been happening for 40 years in the American church, and it's the frog in the kettle because the temperature's been going up slowly. We haven't been freaking out about it, and now, it's over. Like the frog is boiled, he's dead, and now we're realizing this was a problem. Ugh,
Peter Wehner quotes a childhood friend who's now a pastor, Scott Dudley from Bellevue, Washington, who says, many Christians are disinclined to heed calls for civility. They feel that everything they value is under assault and that they need to fight to protect it. I understand that, Dudley said. I feel under assault sometimes too. However, I also know that the early Christians transformed the Roman Empire not by demanding, but by loving, not by angrily shouting about their rights in the public square, but by serving even the people who persecuted them, which is why Christianity grew so quickly and took over the empire. Dudley left Wehner with this question: how many people look at churches in America these days and see the face of Jesus? Too often, I fear, when Americans look at the church, they see not the face of Jesus, but the style of Donald Trump. Russell Moore laments the pugilism of the Trump era, in which anything short of cruelty is seen as weakness. So here we are. Last, because we need to wrap it up. We're running long, but any final... What can we do to help, Skye and Caitlin? Skye, you go first.
Positive note.
What did you say?
It's I know it's odd for me, but
is Caitlin controlling your mouse? What's going on?
No. Here's the thing. I'm not so certain that right now is as bad as... I think right now might be better than 5 years ago. And here's why.
Why?
Because I think all of this stuff existed in the church 5 years ago. It just was veiled behind a facade of niceness, of nice pietistic Christianity. And what Donald Trump did is he was sort of an apocalypse in the true sense of the word, a unveiling, a revealing. Oh. And so as terrible as what's happening now may be, all it really is exposing what was already there. It's showing the true ugliness of the demon that has possessed the American church. And now that we see it clearly, we can recognize how truly ugly it is. But this was there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It just was more hidden. And so in sort of a medical metaphor, I would rather know what the disease is I'm actually up against and have it manifest itself, rather than lie beneath the surface under a facade of health. And so in that regard, I think we're better off because we can see more clearly right now what is darkness and what is light, what is rotten fruit and what is good fruit. And a few years ago, that was harder to tell.
Good point. Good point. Caitlin, last thought.
I think you picked these stories really well, Phil, because that second one, I mean, I think if I heard that separately from the Atlantic article, I just heard this crazy story about Christians like fighting and learning how to fight. I would have been like, oh, there's like this weird small, outlier group that's doing this weird thing. But there's the whole time that you were describing that, I was thinking of a few semesters ago in seminary, reading all of these early Christian writings on war and military service and how often they would have such a posture of, well, of course they're going to hate us. And of course they're going to take everything we have. And of course they're going to kill us because we hold everything in our lives. There's this like wonderful line of an early Christian writer saying, of course they have to kill us because there's nothing else we have that we value as much as the kingdom of God. And so they can't take our stuff. They can't separate our communities because we so highly value Christ and his coming kingdom that the only thing that's left for them to do to us is to kill us. And actually that will be our greatest witness, that we ultimately fear nothing, that we're not even fearing death. And like the just ridiculous chasm that exists between that and we have to fight in our cars for every little, offense. That's the political mentality that a lot of people have. And that's the catechesis that needs to happen, the discipleship that needs to happen. You can have a conversation about wealth and poverty. You can have a conversation about immigration. I think people need to be talking about all those things in their churches. But until you get past that mindset of I have to fight for everything and I am the one that's being persecuted and every political battle I get involved in is an existential threat to my way of life that I have to fight for, you're not going to get anywhere. People could change their minds about a handful of political opinions, but still have this antagonistic relationship to the rest of the world that neither honors God's good creation that is being redeemed or people who are still made in his image and fallen as we are, but is just a better way of interacting and living in the world. And I think a lot of people in churches, we are so focused on the short term, another evangelical thing, like what's the relevant thing right now? What's the political question? I would rather us take a step back and think like, how are we being formed spiritually when it comes to our whole relationship to government, our whole relationship to culture, to our neighbors, people that are different from us. And then that will have outworkings in those specific issues. But we're so chained to whatever the immediate relevant thing is right now that we never end up getting to like the deeper stuff that's actually forming people.
Caitlin, that's what you're going to do with your life.
I hope so.
Yeah, that's your book. It's what you've started. You have, how many decades do you have ahead of you? Like 100? You're so young.
No.
You've got, because we live longer and longer all the time. So you're going to have to teach us how to live again because we've forgotten.
You know what the deal is?
What's the deal?
I really appreciate that, Phil. That was very nice. But I am young and often stupid. And my real heart is we have untold resources in Christian history. We don't need more 25-year-olds writing books like I did that tell us what to do. Unless, hopefully, what my goal was to like point us back to resources that we too often dismiss.
That's good. That is, do that. I was wrong. Do that. Skye, you inspired me that we need to get the evil out in the air so we know what it's there. So I'm going to go downstairs and cut open that darn mushroom and see what's inside it. Because it's better to just cut the mushroom, see what's in it, know what I'm up against, rather than wake up in the middle of the night with it sitting on my face. That's you. You both helped me so much today, and I want to thank you for that.
Sure.
Jason, I loved Sinaholic. Thanks for that, too. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening in. We got a guest today. It's going to be fantastic. You're going to love it. Patreon supporters, thank you. We're doing this because you're supporting us, and we can pay the bills. So keep on supporting, and we will see you next time. Bye.
I know you love The Holy Post because you're here listening to The Holy Post. But did you know that we have another podcast? It's called The Movie Proposal, with me, Josh Lindsay, and Jason Cinnamon Roll Rugg. In each episode, we talk about movies with a matrimonial framework. Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. That means something that blew our minds or which really blew chunks. And very often we look for the spiritual themes in popular movies that other reviewers miss. In the next episode of The Movie Proposal, we're talking about the new movie Electric Jesus, about a Christian heavy metal band in the 1980s starring Brian Baumgartner, best known as Kevin from The Office. And we're joined by the film's writer and director, Chris White. So if you're into movies, culture, faith, and you can handle a dose of irreverence, this is a great week to check out The Movie Proposal. My guest today is Randall Balmer, a professor of religion at Dartmouth College, and the author of many books that I've enjoyed for decades. His latest book is Bad Faith: Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Balmer says the story we've been told about abortion and the origins of the evangelical political movement is really a myth full of half-truths and misdirection. We talk about what really motivated white evangelicals to become politically engaged, and how the real story helps explain what's happening today. And for our Patreon supporters, I've recorded a bonus interview with Randall Balmer about why attempts in the 1970s to organize an evangelical movement on the political left never took off, despite attempts by leaders like George McGovern and Jimmy Carter. It's a bit of history you've probably never heard before, so join our Patreon team today if you want access to that kind of incredible bonus content. Alright, here's my interview with Randall Balmer. Randall Balmer, welcome to The Holy Post.
Thank you. Good to be here, Skye. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mentioned before we started recording that I have been reading your work probably since I was an undergrad in the 90s. I was a double major, but part of it was history. And then I ended up going to seminary at Trinity, where I know you did your work in church history.
I did.
Yeah. I assume you worked with John Woodbridge.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, he was
and
one of my...
Well?
He was one of my professors when I was there, who I enjoyed immensely. I've never had a professor that would lecture while drinking a Mountain Dew and eating a candy bar.
It sounds like John.
Yeah, and he
And he could
wasn't
be very
young.
entertaining.
He was very entertaining, and he made church history come alive, as you do as well with your writing. So I'm indebted to that and appreciative. Your newest book is called Bad Faith: Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. I have my copy right here. It's well annotated. Um, you have discussed this in your other works. Why did you choose to write a standalone book on this topic?
Well, the short answer is, as you know, I did a piece for Politico magazine back in 2014, actually, and they told me at one point that it was the most popular piece that they'd ever posted on their website. I'm sure that's no
Wow.
longer the case, but for a long time it was. And over the years, I keep getting calls about this and asked to comment about it. So I decided, well, why don't I, really try to set out the whole argument and also provide the apparatus of footnotes, so if people doubt what I'm saying or have uh, uh, questions about my method or whatever it might be, they can, look at these sources for themselves. So it was a way for me to expand the argument, to buttress it a bit more with some of the things I've learned since that political article in 2014, and just get it all there in one neat, as you probably noticed, very short book. And I
Yeah,
wanted it to be that way.
we get complaints from some of our listeners because we highlight a lot of great books on this show and have wonderful authors on, and people complain like, I can't keep up with the reading, Skye. Can you please slow down a little bit? But they can digest this book pretty quickly. It's not big, and it's a quick read. Uh, Before we get into the argument of your book
Sure.
and your research, I knew some of your background prior to this. I knew some of your evangelical roots, but you go into greater detail here that I was unaware of, which was really surprising, honestly. Do you mind just sharing a little bit of sort of the context for which you were approaching the study of evangelical history?
No, I don't mind a bit. I don't mind a bit. I grew up in what I've written about and call the evangelical subculture in America, which is this, as you know, this kind of vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, Bible camps, Christian colleges, Bible institutes, seminaries, publishing houses, missionary societies, and so forth. And this is a network of institutions that really emerged in the middle decades of the 20th century, really after, more or less after the Scopes trial of 1925.
Right.
So it was popular. It was possible to grow up in that world, and I can attest to this personally, and have very, very little commerce with anyone outside of that world, that subculture. And that's my childhood. And by the way, I'm not denigrating it at all, because it nurtured me and it made me who I am, and I'm very proud of it in many ways. My father was a minister for 40 years in the Evangelical Free Church of America, and so I grew up in parsonages in southern Minnesota, rural southern Minnesota, Bay City, Michigan, Des Moines, Iowa, and various places. And I honor both his memory and his ministry. He was really, in many ways, an extraordinary man. And uh, probably what you were getting at in your question is his role in the production of a movie that became what Time Magazine called a church basement classic. And that's a movie called A Thief in the Night. And I expect many of your listeners have heard of this film as well. And it's a film that tries to depict the rapture, when, according to this mode of biblical interpretation, Jesus is going to come back to earth, the second coming, and take the faithful out of this world. And those who will be left behind, and by the way, Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series was inspired by this film called A Thief in the Night, which in turn was inspired by my father's Sunday night sermons at the Westchester Evangelical Free Church in Des Moines, Iowa. He would often preach on the book of Revelation. And Don Thompson, who was actually also my Sunday school teacher, uh, decided to make a film of this. He wrote the script, and it was produced in 1972. And it became, really quite a phenomenon, really. I mean, I've run into, can't tell you how many people over the years who have seen the film and somehow knew my connection with it. My father, by the way, is the good preacher, the good pastor in that film, and he plays himself. And so that's part of my background. So I can keep going. I went on to Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois in 1972 as an undergraduate, and then stayed to do MA in church history at Trinity Divinity School while working in the development department. So let me put it this way, Skye. I will put my evangelical credentials up against anyone, even Franklin Graham. His father was more famous than mine, but my evangelical credentials are pretty solid.
Yeah, you're echoing the Apostle Paul when he said that his Jewish credentials will stand against anyone. He was a Jew among Jews, and yet counted it all as nothing. Right.
That's right.
So, given that background, you've written this book because that era of the 1970s, right? The Thief in the Night era, Great Late Planet Earth, all that stuff was going on.
Right.
It was also the era in which we see the rise of the religious right, which really comes to fruition by 1980. And you want to dismantle the myth of the story of the religious right. So first, let's begin with, what is the myth itself?
The myth is what I call the abortion myth, and it's the fiction, and I'm happy to go into the details here a little bit too. It's the fiction that the religious right, or that evangelicals more generally organized as a political movement in the 1970s in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1972. And this is a story that has been perpetrated, really by the leaders of the religious right. And I think part of the reason for it is that it provides a kind of a noble cause behind their political mobilization in the 1970s. But if you begin to look more closely into the details, you see that that's not the case. Abortion had nothing to do with it. And I'll just, again, the book goes into a lot of detail about this, and footnotes and more examples that I can marshal here or want to take the time to talk about here. But let's just start with a couple of things. 1968. Christianity Today magazine, which, as you know, is kind of the flagship magazine for evangelicalism.
I used to work there.
I used to write for them too, actually. Did a lot of features for them. Did you really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, for 11 years. I quit 3 times. I'm glad you're going here. I actually had your book open to this page where I've outlined all this stuff. You're tracing exactly what I want to talk about. So yeah, 1968, CT, explain what they did.
Christianity Today magazine co-sponsored a conference with the Christian Medical Society to talk about the morality surrounding abortion. And this is a gathering of some of the heavyweight theologians of the evangelical world to discuss this matter. And they hash it out over several days. And they end up issuing a statement. And I don't have it in front of me. I guess you do too. So maybe I'll ask you to read it.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
The statement was, whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed. But about the necessity of it and the permissibility of it under certain circumstances, we are in accord. Individual health, family welfare, and social responsibility are possible justifications for abortion, and allowed for instances when fetal life may have to be abandoned to maintain full and secure family life.
It's quite a remarkable statement when you think about it.
Yeah, that sounds like the Clinton campaign in 1992, basically saying safe, legal, and rare.
It does, actually. I hadn't thought of it distilled to that slogan, but yes, it really was. 1971, just to go on with a bit more evidence here. 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is not exactly known as a liberal bastion, passed a resolution at their meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, calling for the legalization of abortion.
I'm sorry, can I read that quote also?
Sure, please.
This is your work, so it's worth it.
Please.
This is the quote from the SBC, 1971. We call upon Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother.
Yeah, again, it's a pretty, it's not exactly an anti-abortion statement by any stretch of the imagination. And They reaffirmed that resolution in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976.
Right.
W.A. Criswell, one of the most famous evangelicals of the 20th century, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, a man who had been actually several times president of the Southern Baptist Convention, applauded the Roe v. Wade decision when it was handed down on January 22nd, 1973. And there's even a quote in there, again, I don't have it in front of me, from James Dobson, and I think you're going to read it for us.
Oh, gosh. I don't know if I have that one
I think
underlined.
it's page 36, if I remember.
Oh, you're good. I do have it underlined. I just wasn't at the page yet.
Yeah. Dobson. This is James
Dobson says, quote, a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. Let me put it in its proper context. That's Harold Lindell, 1970. Okay. You write, James Dobson, who later became an implacable foe of abortion, acknowledged in 1973 that the Bible was silent on the matter, and therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as full human being.
That's 1973.
Yeah.
I'll just add one more bit of evidence to demolish what I call the abortion myth. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. So all of this is what I call the abortion myth. And the abortion myth is the fiction that the religious right mobilizes a political movement in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate.
Sure.
And concede the point that in the late 60s, early 70s, and around the passage of Roe, white evangelicals were not upset. They were not stirred into action by this. By the late 70s, white evangelicals were stirred into action and political engagement again. As you said, Falwell gives his anti-abortion message in 1978. Can you make a case that they just changed their mind? They came to the realization of the horrors of abortion, and it was a delayed response, but it was nonetheless abortion that did animate the movement?
I could, and in the sense that, yes, there's no question that evangelicals got on board the anti-abortion bandwagon. But what happened between that awakening and Roe v. Wade in 1973 was another set of circumstances that really did get the leaders of the religious right on board.
Right. So let's go there. Explain, everyone knows Roe versus Wade. Explain Green versus Connolly.
Yes.
The court case that we rarely have ever heard about.
That's right. Green v. Connolly. Well, first of all, the background for Green v. Connolly actually goes back to the Brown decision of May 17, 1954, when the Supreme Court directed that public schools in America, public education, needed to be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed. Fast forward another 10 years, and you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade racial discrimination or racial segregation in public institutions. Green v. Connolly. What happened in Holmes County, Mississippi, is that the first year of desegregation for the public schools in Holmes County, the number of white students in the public schools dropped from over 700 to 28. The second year of desegregation, the number of white students in Holmes County, Mississippi public schools dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 whites-only segregation academies, church-sponsored, I'm ashamed to say, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, wait a minute, that's not right. And so they filed suit. That suit was joined with another suit. And again, this has a long sort of judicial history, which we don't need to get into. Eventually, that case finds its way up to the district court for the District of Columbia in a case called Green v. Connolly. Connolly because John Connolly was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of the Treasury is over the Internal Revenue Service. On June 31st, 1971, the district court for the District of Columbia issued a decision that said, in effect, that any institution that engages in racial discrimination or racial segregation is not, by definition, a charitable institution. And for that reason, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. And as the IRS, over the course of the 1970s, began to enforce that decision, which, by the way, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford endorsed, that is, they abided by that decision.
Yeah,
As the
Republican
IRS,
presidents.
Republican presidents, as the IRS began to enforce that decision over the course of the 1970s, Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, and other evangelical leaders got upset about this, and they decided to mobilize against this. Now, waiting in the wings for all this was a man by the name of Paul Weyrich, who is really the architect of the religious right. And I had a conversation with Weyrich, back in November of 1990, and he was emphatic, first of all, about the fact that abortion had nothing to do with the mobilization of evangelical leaders in the 1970s. But as I pressed him on the issue, he said that he had been trying as a conservative activist since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to organize evangelicals politically. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue, which was a big issue in the 1960s. I tried the abortion issue. I tried women's rights. I tried the pornography issue. Nothing got their attention until the IRS began to come after the tax exemption for these evangelical schools. And that, he said, and by the way, I have lots of corroborating evidence for that. But that, he said, is what got these people, meaning Jerry Falwell and others, interested in politics in the 1970s. Abortion had nothing to do with it. So getting back to your question, you're absolutely right. By the end of the 1970s, evangelicals were starting to catch on to the abortion issue. But it was not in direct response to Roe v. Wade. And the intervening circumstances were the mobilization of these evangelical leaders to defend racial segregation. There's no pretty way to put it. They were defending racial segregation in their institutions. And they, to put it even more starkly, they were defending racism.
Okay, there's a number of different pieces I want to unpack here. One of them is what these religious leaders were doing in their defense of their segregation academies. They weren't coming out, most of them were not coming out directly and saying, we want to defend segregation and we want to defend racism. They were using they were using a very old tactic of claiming this was a federal government overreach.
Right.
Yeah. So the IRS is interfering in a state's issue or in a private religious matter. So they were framing it as a matter of religious liberty and states' rights, which is exactly what the Confederacy did 100 years earlier, 150 years earlier, saying, you stay out of our business. We can have slavery if we want. The federal government shouldn't be involved. So, and you still hear echoes of that same argument to this day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the other piece, early in the book, you have a section talking about the role, and this is getting into theology a bit and history, but the role that dispensationalism had in setting up the conditions for this. If you can briefly explain, and we've talked about a lot on this program over the years, but explain dispensationalism, how it led to the mindset, particularly in the South, of cultural disengagement and isolation.
Yeah.
That then freaked people out when the IRS got involved in pulling tax-exempt status from these schools.
Right. I love the summons to explain dispensationalism briefly.
Yes.
That's a challenge.
Well, okay. I think everyone listening to this program has encountered dispensationalism. Sure. They just didn't know that's what it was called.
It's in, if you're an evangelical, it's in the air. It's in the atmosphere. You've got to, okay, quickly. I'll try to do it quickly. In the book of Revelation, chapter 18, if I remember correctly, there's a reference to something called the millennium, which is 1,000 years of righteousness, which is going to come about at some future date. That's the typical understanding of this. Well, the question has always been throughout church history, is that 1,000 years going to happen before Jesus returns to earth or after Jesus returns to earth? Well, on the face of it, as you say, who cares? I mean, this is these are theologians with angels dancing on the head of a pin, but it has enormous consequences. So what happens in the early part of the 19th century is that evangelicals believed that Jesus was going to return after the millennial kingdom had been established. So the corollary of that, and this is very important, is that evangelicals understood themselves as trying to prepare that millennial kingdom, try to make way for the kingdom of God to come here on earth, more particularly here in America. So you had this really remarkable energizing of reform efforts in the 19th century, prison reform. Public education was a very much an evangelical concern in the 19th century. Women's equality, again, very much an evangelical priority in the 19th century, including voting rights, which was considered a rather radical idea at the time. Peace crusades, the abolition of slavery. Now, you had evangelicals in the South, as you noted, who are defending slavery. But in the North, evangelicals are trying to get rid of the scourge of slavery. And they're all of these actions are animated by post-millennialism. That is, Jesus is going to come back after we establish this millennial kingdom. Well, what happens, again, trying to be very quick about this, what happens over the course of the 19th century, particularly the second half of the 19th century, is that evangelicals began to look around themselves and said, wait a minute, we thought we were building this millennial kingdom, but look at the tenements on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, this teeming, squalid tenements roiling with labor unrest. Look at the influx of all of these non-Protestant immigrants who don't share our scruples about temperance. And so they begin to kind of cast about and begin to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we had interpreted this wrong. We thought we were building this millennial kingdom, but the Lower East Side of Manhattan doesn't exactly look like the precincts of Zion. And so they cast about for a new biblical mode of biblical interpretation, and they import one from Britain, essentially, in the person of a man named John Nelson Darby. And he comes to America and he said, you guys have got it all wrong. You've been reading the Bible wrong. Jesus is not going to return to earth after you create this millennial kingdom. Jesus is going to come back before the millennium. And this is called premillennialism, or also dispensational premillennialism. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but dispensationalism says that God has dealt differently with humanity and the church in different ways throughout history. I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, I'm happy to get into the weeds.
No, we don't have to go there in this. It's not relevant.
But the upshot of premillennialism or dispensationalism is Jesus is going to come back at any moment. Well, you think about that. What are the ramifications of that? And they're profound, because what happens as evangelicals begin to adopt dispensationalism or dispensational premillennialism around the turn of the 20th century is that they begin to say, well, wait a minute, why are we working so hard to reform society? Jesus is coming back at any moment. We don't have to worry about this. So it really absolved evangelicals of the task of social amelioration or social betterment, because it said, there's nothing we can do to make this world a better place. I mean, the famous quote from D.L. Moody, I look upon this world as a wrecked vessel, he said. God has given me a lifeboat and said, Moody, save all you can. And so that signals a shift away from social reform, which had been very much part of the evangelical agenda in the 19th century, toward individual regeneration. And if I can just skip over the decades here, again, trying to compress this as much as possible. That is what animates A Thief in the Night, right? That's what made my father, and I'm not at all denigrating my father, and he was very sincere in his belief in premillennialism. That's what made him preach about the book of Revelation and try to urge individuals to give their hearts to Jesus before Jesus came back to earth, because at that point, then all this terrible judgment would be rained down on the earth, and that in turn is what inspired A Thief in the Night, as well as more recently the Left Behind series.
So to bring it back around then to segregation academies and some of the reaction to the South with the IRS, this premillennial dispensationalism drives a lot of evangelicals to believe we need to disengage from society and more or less protect ourselves, our families, our communities, preserve them until Jesus returns. So disconnection, isolation, preservation. And some people in the South especially viewed these efforts on the federal government to integrate society and integrate schools was an infringement upon their desire to preserve their little enclaves. So they retreat into these segregation academies where they think we're safe. And then here comes the IRS men knocking out the door saying, no, you're not. We want you to pay taxes because of what you're doing.
Right.
And they lose their minds.
They do.
Okay, so that explains a lot of the South and the emergence of the religious right and political activism among conservative white evangelicals in the South. The North is a bit different. There's lots of racial tension in the North. I live in Wheaton, Illinois, outside Chicago. My mom went to high school on the west side of Chicago. She remembers the 1960s and the integration efforts that went on there. So it was by no means a racial panacea either. But there weren't the segregation academy IRS issues the way there were in the South necessarily. So what brought the North along, or the Midwest or the West, into this larger conservative movement around the religious right?
Yeah, I think it is primarily it is the abortion issue as it begins to kind of circulate. I'm really struck. Frank Schaeffer and I've become, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we've become friends over the last few years. And you probably remember, or I'm not presuming how old you are, but you certainly have heard about a film series called "Whatever Happened to the Human Race."
Absolutely, yeah.
That was produced by Frank Schaeffer, directed by Frank Schaeffer, and it featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, who in many ways was the intellectual godfather of the religious right, together with a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop. And that film series was, really the burden of that series was to say that any society that embraced abortion would very quickly move on to allow both infanticide as well as euthanasia. And it was part of a moral decay within society and so forth. Well, Frank has talked about this over the years and has kind of backed off a little bit from that. I think it's fair to say, but he claims that as that film series circulated the country in the first 3 months of 1979. The audiences, the evangelical audiences, were far less than robust, far less than the previous film series, which was "How Shall We Then Live" with Francis Schaeffer. So even 1979 is still, the abortion issue is still kind of on the fringes of evangelical sensibilities. For me, one of the telling moments is that when Ronald Reagan addressed this huge gathering of evangelicals down at Reunion Arena in Dallas on August 22nd, 1980, just before the election in 1980. I looked through his speech when I was doing research out at the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley. And in that speech, he talks about creationism. He rails against Jimmy Carter and the Internal Revenue Service for going after the tax exemption of evangelical schools. And he says nothing whatsoever about abortion. This is August of 1980. So even then, it was not clear that abortion was going to work for Reagan as a political issue. And the larger background, of course, the larger background is that evangelicals regarded abortion as a Catholic issue throughout most of the 1970s.
Right. Well, when Reagan was governor of California, he signed not only one of the most liberal divorce laws and the first, I think, no-fault divorce law in the country into law, but also one of the most expansive abortion laws.
1967, yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
So, and your point is a dramatic one for those of us who are old enough to remember it. Like the 1980 election is kind of the religious right election where they really came to the forefront, and yet abortion wasn't even central to it. Okay.
Yeah.
In recent years, we have heard from many, many, many evangelicals, both the politically visible ones and just your, run-of-the-mill pew sitters, that abortion is the reason they vote. Right? It's the reason they elected Trump in 2016. The Supreme Court is everything. Your historical research has shown that that wasn't the origin of the religious right, although it became a plank within the
Yeah. Oh,
movement, and it's
absolutely.
right, and it is the myth that we like to say that gave rise to it. Um, did you, I don't know if you happen to see the Lifeway research that came out in 2018 about
Mm.
the 2016 election. So Lifeway is the Southern Baptist, and they did a very extensive study with the Billy Graham Association of white evangelical voters. And part of that survey was um, determining the priority of different issues in how people actually voted.
Mhm.
And one of the most stunning things in the report is that abortion came in ninth in importance.
Is that right? I did not know that.
Ninth.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court nominees came in 10th in
Mm.
importance.
Wow.
So obviously it begs the question, what was the most important issue or issues for evangelical voters, white evangelicals? Number one was the economy. Number two was healthcare. Number three was immigration and taxes.
Huh. Wow.
So it's when I saw that, it was just interesting to me. And then reading your book and this research again, not a lot has changed
Right.
in that
Right.
we're still using the rhetoric of abortion to justify
Right.
our voting behavior.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, what's actually motivating the vote is about money, finances, and I would lump immigration there in with race issues as
Yeah.
an
Sure.
animating force. So that brings me to toward the end of our conversation here. Here's the big question I have: so what?
Yeah.
So what? Like if it was racial segregation and the IRS coming after these segregation academies that really was the spark for the religious right, what does it matter today?
Great
If that's what,
question.
yeah,
Great question. No, I think it's that's a logical question, and it's a very good one. I think it matters because my sense of history, American religious history, is that unaddressed racism has a tendency to fester, and it doesn't go away. The example I use in the book is you can build this beautiful structure, uh, uh, a building with all sorts of fancy appointments and filigrees and so forth. But if it's resting on rotten timbers, the integrity of the entire structure is compromised, it seems to me. And in this case, I think one of the things I tried to do in the book is to say, how do we account? And this was a genuine puzzle for me, and it still is to some degree. How do you account for 81% of white evangelicals? Again, the modifier white is important here.
yeah, very,
81% of white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump in 2016. Now, this is a movement that has been kind of protesting for decades that we're about family value. Well, I'm sorry, you cannot make that argument and vote for Donald Trump. I'm sorry, you can't. It doesn't wash. And I think the 2016 election was for me a wake up call, as it was for many others, of course, in that as I began to look back and say, wait a minute, here you have a movement, the religious right, that began in defense of racism. Again, there's no pretty way to say that, but that's what it was. And votes for Donald Trump overwhelmingly in 2016. Gee, I wonder if there's a connection here. And I think there is. I think the 2016 election allowed the religious right finally to circle back to the charter principle behind its formation, which is racism. And I don't think we have to have a conversation, although I'm willing to have it, about whether or not Donald Trump is racist, or at least uses racist rhetoric. I think that issue is pretty settled in the minds of most people. And that to me was the connection. And turns out the intervening connection, and I'm sorry, I'm sad to say this in many ways, but the intervening connection was Ronald Reagan. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. But I think that's the path. And there's
yeah.
just kind of a line, a through line from um, Jerry Falwell and the origins of the religious right, all the way to Donald Trump in 2016 and again in 2020, and who knows, what's going to happen.
Yeah, your research and that of some others has been really helpful in putting this narrative together for me. And what it feels like, as you've laid out very clearly, in the South, it was segregation and the isolation of segregation academies that was the igniting
Right.
spark for the religious right. In the North, it was a little bit different, but the piece that's beginning to make sense to me is Ronald Reagan comes on the scene, and a lot of Northern conservatives who are evangelicals really liked his rhetoric and message
Sure.
around lower taxes, smaller government, less regulation, all that kind of stuff. Reagan threw a bone to the Southerners about, the IRS and segregation, and he had a lot of dog whistle stuff that went on in his campaign about race. And everyone needed, whether it was your economic interests or racial interests, everyone in the white evangelical subculture who really was attracted to Reagan needed some kind of self-righteous veneer to hide what were unrighteous values, and abortion served that purpose.
No, again, setting aside the merits of the arguments for and against abortion, and I'm not
Yeah.
prepared. I'm prepared to debate them, but that's not where our conversation is. I think you have to look back and say that for the religious right, abortion was a godsend. It was, because it allowed them to divert attention from the real origins of their movement.
Right.
And the other point to make here is that, and again, I'm not trying to denigrate or diminish people who are sincerely opposed to abortion, and I number myself among them. But in many ways, opposition to abortion, aligning oneself with a fetus, is not a terribly painful political position to take. A fetus doesn't demand education. A fetus doesn't demand health care. A fetus doesn't demand basic human needs. And so, yeah, I'm sounding flippant here, and I don't mean to do that. That's not my point. My point is to say that in many ways, abortion or opposition to abortion was the ideal issue that came along. And again, as my research shows, and I think I'm pretty clear about this, evangelicals really stumbled on that issue in the late 1970s. And Frank Schaeffer would be the first to say that as well. He will be the first to admit that.
Yeah.
It wasn't at all clear that that's the direction that he was going to go in with whatever happened to the human race.
As we wrap up here, and I'm glad you shared that toward the end, we've had people on this show, and I count myself also among them, who are sincerely pro-life and root that position in their Christian faith.
Sure. Absolutely.
That's not what we're debating here. But the history needs to be seen, and I think even this recent data that's come from Lifeway shows many evangelicals continue to use the abortion issue as a red herring, as a distraction from the things that they care far more about, and that's what needs to be called out. Randall, would you be willing to stick around for a few minutes for like a 10-minute bonus conversation?
Of course.
Okay. I want to talk to you. There's a part of your book where you talk about the McGovern campaign in 1972.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's intriguing to me is back then, it was not at all apparent that white evangelicals would become a significant block of the Republican Party. There was a possibility of them remaining or connecting more with the Democratic Party. So I want to talk about some of that history in a bonus segment for our Patreon supporters. But thank you for the new book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. For those of you who are tired of me recommending books because you can't keep up, you do need to get this one because it's short. It's a quick read. It will give you a lot of resources and data to talk to friends, colleagues, members of your church about this history and open their eyes a little bit to it so you can see how it's still manifesting itself today. Dr. Balmer, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Skye. Thank you so much.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.